Welcome, everyone. We will divide our presentation into 3 parts. I'm Jennifer Carpenter. I'm going to kick us off. We'll have 2-minute breaks between the parts where you can stretch a bit, but we're also going to ask you a poll question. And our first topic is, what's the workplace currently like for neurodivergent people? And that will be followed by, what can the design process look like with neurodiversity in mind? And then, what can you do now? And a reminder that we want you to be as you are. I'm standing right now, but you can sit, you can also stand, you can lay, stim, pace, keep your camera off or on, whatever helps you focus the best. And now Rachel will get us started with, what's the workplace currently like for neurodivergent people?
Thanks,
Rachel?
Jennifer. My autism diagnosis impacted my work experience in a positive way. Simply knowing I was autistic allowed me to advocate for myself. After 4 months in the real world after college, I received my autism and ADHD diagnosis. Now that I had the hidden key to understand why I was struggling so much, I could finally advocate for where my misunderstandings and miscommunications were and why, and then I could work through them with other people. My biggest challenge for me after college was transitioning to a new life structure. Like many, all I had known was school. I loved the implicitly built routines and predictability that school had made for me. But now that it was gone, I was a full-time employee in a laboratory planning firm. My support and comforts and structure and predictability were lost. So my executive functioning declined. I struggled staying organized and communicating my intentions. I became more anxious and depressed, and so I overbooked myself with activities outside of work to keep me busy and entertained. I felt like I was drowning. But my coworkers have been really supportive by simply listening to my experience and validating how I feel. Some coworkers have reminded me to take notes because I often forget when unprompted. Some coworkers have worked with me on my email writing habits, understanding workplace culture. I struggle to communicate my emotions, especially in emails, because I feel I need to be brief and professional in a work setting. And I end up stripping my personality from work emails and communication sometimes. Other coworkers have simply thanked me for my tedious, ness and love for detail or repetitive tasks, because not everyone loves to do them, so they celebrate this. However, not everyone has had the positive experience that I have had, but luckily traction is being made in the hiring practices of many companies today. Ev, what is the workplace like for you?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful.
We can.
Okay.
Hi, Ev.
So like Rachel, my diagnosis came later in life. I was diagnosed in the early bit of college, the second year of college, with autism and an anxiety disorder. And that came after finally just struggling through college. So in grade school, I was gifted. I was in the gifted program. My academic skills were really, really high. And so any struggling I may have been having socially just kind of slipped under the radar. Or if it was noticed, it wasn't seen as a big deal because I was gifted, so I was fine. But in college, I started really realizing, where I sort of had these skills mismatches. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So I ended up being diagnosed with autism after doing a whole lot of research on myself and talking with a therapist and whatever, because I was struggling with, knowing how to do things cognitively, but then struggling to manage sensory input and struggling to manage the social interactions that happen in college, which are vastly different than grade school. And then you move from college to the workplace, and that's vastly different from each other. And you're just kind of thrown in there and expected to know how things work. So part of having my diagnosis really helped, and I have this chart here to kind of show it. I like this chart because it shows where there could be a skill mismatch. So you can see my talent level is really, really high. Like cognitively, I know really easily things that are happening, or my perception is really high, but the way I process that information is in a very neurodivergent style. So in a way that's different from others. So like some things that I need in the workplace, or what happened, or some things that people do for me at work are, when I get like a lot of instructions on doing a new task, I get them written down and then brought to me, and I get to physically work through it with somebody there. Because if you just describe to me verbally, I'm not going to process any of that, and I'm not going to remember it. So that's the thing that I need. Or if something is really, really loud, I'm not going to be able to figure out anything else in that moment. So if like the fire alarm goes off, I'm not expected to help with the emergency evacuation. I'm just expected to get myself out of the school. So my colleague Kate is going to cover barriers to neuro inclusion.
Great. Thank you, Ev. And thank you, Rachel and Ev, for sharing your stories there. I think it's so important to personalize, kind of these broad abstract concepts that we're talking about. So while Ev and Rachel were able to personalize that, I'm going to talk a bit broader in terms of what we see largely as barriers to neuro inclusion in the workplace. So you heard a little bit about the physical environment, right? That can obviously be a barrier or support, right? But here we're going to focus on barriers in the sensory environment. Is the physical environment accessible? Is there flexibility in where and how you work? But also when we're thinking about neuro inclusion, we have to think about the whole environment, and that includes the other humans, as you've heard Ev and Rachel both refer to, right? Do those people in the workplace understand neurodiversity? Are they flexible in their communication styles and understanding how to flex communication based on who they're working with? Managers, are they competent in being good individualized managers? This all plays a huge role. Also, workplace processes, specifically the interview process, that is one that relies really heavily on neurotypical norms. For example, if you think about in the case of autism, perhaps eye contact is even painful in some cases, right? But a neurotypical interviewer might expect eye contact. Or, in the case of Tourette's, maybe a tic is misunderstood. So when we think about all of the different ways to be a neurodivergent, these processes can really have different factors that impact success for those people going through them. Communication norms, right? Is calling someone out of the blue okay? Or are there norms around how you communicate? Feedback processes, the hidden curriculum. This is one that I think is really fascinating when we talk about what is just known in your company's culture. So, right, some companies maybe don't schedule meetings past 3 p.m. and somebody who's new to the company might not know that unless that's explicitly stated, right? So thinking about how that can be a barrier when others might perceive you differently if you schedule a 4:30 p.m. meeting on a Friday, but nobody told you that that wasn't expected, right? And then finally, workplace practices. We talk broadly in the workplace about benefits and supports that might be available, but often these don't specifically consider the needs of neurodivergent employees, which can be another barrier. And Ev is going to go back here to our poll.
So here's our first poll. To answer our questions, you can scan this QR code with your phone. You can just point your camera at it and it should come up with a little link you can click to answer the poll.
And I'll pull that up, Ev, on the Slido,
Yeah.
but is there also a way for us to share this link maybe in the Q&A if there's not apparently there's not a chat on this Zoom, but we'd also like to be able to share that. Is that possible, Kate, to put it in the Q&A?
I do not have that functionality here.
Okay.
I'm looking to see if there might be a way.
Maybe. Okay, so if someone from TJU can help us with that.
I think our tech team cannot do that because it's a webinar. I'm not sure. I don't understand the logistics, but because of the format of the Zoom, none of us has the chat option, unfortunately.
Sure. If someone could assign a question to me in the Q&A, I'd be happy to drop it in there.
Yeah, perfect, Kate. That's a great idea.
Okay. So can you all see the question on your screen? Okay, great. So you'll see the results coming in. Also, please feel free to walk around just for a few seconds or a minute
And I
Need a
know there's
break?
lots of different options you can choose from. You can choose multiple. Just make sure you scroll all the way to the bottom and hit send. Or I think send is the like green button.
Oh, that's
Otherwise,
right.
not
If you
submit
don't
it.
hit send, your results will not be recorded.
Lesson learned.
Yeah, for me too.
And a quick note too, that by workplace, we also mean, you know, an internship, part-time, full-time, volunteering, anything like that.
So this is interesting. The Slido format that we're using is sorting them by popularity, right? So we can see the most popular responses at the top, and then
Great.
I can kind of scroll down and show the ones that are getting less of a response.
And thank you to whoever put the question in the Q&A. So the link is now in there if you weren't able to scan it with your phone.
Oh, great. Perfect.
Fantastic.
Trying to give options with UDL, maybe, you know, people don't have a phone on them, so they can, you know, copy the link and put it in Google or whatever engine you use.
So we'll keep this up for about another 30 seconds, and then we'll move on. Looks like has heard about neurodiversity. That's getting a good response, and defines neurodiversity be more than autism also. Is doing nothing, 14%.
You know, that's good though. That's a low number.
That is a low number. Wants to know more about neurodiversity, 32%. Recognizes at 55. Okay, great. Thank you all. I'm going to turn to our presentation. Okay, thumbs up, you guys can see again. Great. So part 2, what can the design process look like with neurodiversity in mind? So I'm going to start off by addressing this, and I'm addressing it specifically as an architect, speaking here to some other designers and architects. I think it's important to keep in mind that these ideas have broader applications, and there are so many people in different areas of influence that come together to make a workplace, and all of us can really play a role in making that place more inclusive. So I want to focus on 2 ideas that we use at BCA to try to make our design process and also the products of that design process more neuro-inclusive. And one of those is a sensory audit. And we've heard a bit about that today, and I'm happy to reinforce some of the ideas that we heard from Adam earlier. And the sensory overlay. So this overlay approach, I just want to point out, is not just an approach that we think works for those who struggle with sensory integration, but also an approach that works for inclusion in general. So we're defining neurodiversity to be autism, but also beyond autism. Let's start with the sensory audit. This is a broadly inclusive process where we're seeking feedback from all the stakeholders in the early phase of a design project to understand what is working and what is not working about a client's current space and their culture, really, from a sensory perspective. And the sensory audit plan that you see here is from a school project that just opened last month that we worked on. And we want this sensory audit process to be really full of a range of insights and not just input from the people who might be most likely to volunteer information, most likely to raise their hand, or from the people who are in charge. So we ask for access in different ways from the client, and we offer the client access to us in different ways. So this could include written surveys and questions, phone calls, Zoom calls, group walkthroughs, or even individual walkthroughs. So we're providing multiple means of engaging, expressing, and representing. So for example, in a walkthrough that I did with just 2 students, one of them shared that they would retreat here under this desk when they needed a sensory break. The student lounge was too crowded and it was too loud. And so input like this allowed us to make a really strong case for multiple different break spaces with different sensory characteristics, even within a tight floor plan with a lot of competing programs that were competing for square footage. So the sensory audit process recognizes that experience is individual. It's not universal. There's no such thing as a universal sensory response to a space. So this process helps us and our client remember that we can't just privilege the visual as well. Design is, of course, a very visual field and traditionally has a visual focus, but this is really just one part of the sensory picture. And that brings me to the second concept of the sensory overlay design approach. So as a designer, you realize that you can really shape sensory experience at every scale of your project. And that includes site and space planning, building systems, finishes, furniture, down to signs and wayfinding. And so our focus during design is not just thinking about function, but with this overlay approach, we're thinking instead about how can we build this range of sensory environments that provide flexibility and choice and can do what we call allowing the space to meet you where you are. And we use that approach here at a project that we did for the Princeton University Art Museum offices. And as with most of our projects, the client wasn't coming to us with a specific goal of neuro-inclusion, but they really responded to the idea that we could create spaces that gave people multiple options for work environments so they had choice and agency. And this is a page from a presentation to the client where we're pitching this idea of environments for choice that would allow people to feel comfortable. And in yellow and orange, you can see all the spaces other than an assigned desk where staff can go to work alone or in groups. So everyone in the office does have an assigned desk, and it's a sit to stand adjustable one. It's got its own task light, and it's either in an office over here or in this open workstation area that is semi-protected. It's screened by millwork and also mediated by a screen of plants that are hanging from a soffit that, in addition to supporting our plants, is concealing and buffering the air distribution system that's keeping everyone comfortable. And you have a lot of options for working away from your desk. You can sit here in an open corner that's sited next to lots of daylight if you want it, but you can modulate that daylight with shades that you can control. The chairs move, they're on casters. Or you could move here and work, if you want more sensory input, in a bustling space that might smell like coffee from the pantry nearby, has more color on the walls, has a decorative pattern on the ceiling. But on some days, you might rather be here with a rocking chair as a seating option. It's a quieter corner, it's a more neutral palette, and it's away from the workstations. It's sort of furthest located from those busier spots. And if you want solo space, we have a range of options for sensory characteristics and furniture. So they all have easy access to power. So if you want to sort of sit down here and plug in for a while, you can. But at the left, you have an enclosed room. It's got acoustic privacy. It's got a lower ceiling. In the middle here, open, loftier, next to the sounds of that larger lounge that had the coffee, and where you'd see people walking by. But then at the right, you're in a kind of dead end corridor where in fact you would not see anybody walking by, a very different environment to be alone. So with this approach, you'll end up with some purposeful redundancy in space so that there's not going to be this one-to-one relationship between people and chairs or between program and space. So you are providing more choice. And speaking of choices, Rachel, can you share some ideas about how the UDL principles apply to workplace design in your opinion?
Sure. So UDL is Universal Design for Learning, and this is vastly different than what us as designers call universal design. Universal design for learning is often used in classrooms to inclusively consider variations of learning and communication preferences for instruction. So think, how do you learn best? Reading, writing, listening, speaking, playing games, drawing. And then how do others around you prefer to learn? Or even explain things like, your coworkers, siblings, parents, spouse, or peers. The design process should consider this as well, as the design process is a learning and communication exchange between the client and the design team. The client is a subject matter expert of themselves and what they do, and so is the design team. But due to our personal preferences and preferences of our disciplines, we learn and communicate differently. So how can we clearly communicate together as a team so everyone's preferences are considered? You can ask them these questions while you're working with them. For example, as designers, we typically communicate with drawings, diagrams, and floor plans, but not everyone understands these. So for example, I've heard in the workplace, a lot, clients may not understand our plans, so we'll make, perspectives or axons. You could also show models, perspectives, like I mentioned, movies, animations. You can add text annotations to your images. You can describe the images simultaneously as you're displaying them. When wanting to learn about the client, questionnaires can go beyond writing or typing answers. They could be phone calls or video calls. They could be in-person walkthroughs like Jennifer was showing, or they could discuss existing facilities while walking through these spaces. So you're kind of using a little bit of everything then. You're seeing, experiencing, talking together, listening. You can also provide material days ahead for any workshop. So if, someone hasn't been in a workshop before, they can at least know the material that's going to be discussed or the format in which it is. A lot of users we've experienced in going through workshop processes afterwards have been like, I didn't understand what we were doing before, but now I see how all of it goes together. So having that familiarity of, seeing ahead of time what this typology is could be beneficial. You can, and so you can kind of educate them on, your work process so that they know how all this information comes together. And then this can be applied to any process of implementation. So this is not just an architecture thing. You can apply it to policy and program. It's really a universal way of communicating regardless of your discipline. And now Kate.
Yes, I love that idea because I don't come from the architecture or design world, but I definitely see how this same process works in all of these different ideas. And I want to encourage you as you think about this, if you're coming from that design world, absolutely think about this in terms of the spaces you're designing, but also think about this in terms of your own workplace, because chances are you're almost guaranteed to be working with neurodivergent colleagues, leadership. So this applies to you where you are right now. So this slide, we saw this slide in the first part, looking at what are some barriers to neuroinclusion. So now I want to talk about, what are some practices for neuroinclusion? And I want to note that these aren't hard and fast rules, things to do, but these are some examples of what people are currently doing to promote neuroinclusion. As Rachel alluded to, when we think about neuroinclusion, we have to think about these processes in all different aspects: the physical environment, the human environment, workplace processes, and workplace practices. So you get some of the same results. When we think about the physical environment, Jennifer just really spoke really well to those flexible spaces with differing sensory profiles, physically accessible places, and flexibility in workplaces, right? Maybe you have that option to work remote all the time or a couple days a week. When we think about the human environment, right? How can we train people to communicate inclusively, to be flexible in working styles, especially when it comes to managers? As I mentioned before, that's a big one. The workplace processes, when you think about an interview, how many different options can you offer? Can you offer a traditional interview, a video recorded interview, a text entry interview, perhaps a skills-based interview where you show what you can do instead of having to talk about what you do? There's so many options we can provide people to best showcase their skills. Schedule feedback in multiple formats, as Rachel just talked about: written, video, audio, visual, making sure your points are really getting across. And that's the same for the workplace practices and looking at that presentation of information for everything, agendas, meeting notes, all of these different things. Other workplace practices that aren't necessarily flexible, but really targeted for inclusion are employee resource groups or affinity groups, things that bring people together around this neurodivergent identity. You might also consider specific supports in the workplace, like mental health supports or career coaching. So again, this is really some of the products of that questioning that Rachel was talking about, produces these sorts of things, but there's various things that still haven't been discovered that can create a more neuro-inclusive world. And Ev, I know you feel really strongly about these practices, not only being specifically for neurodivergent people, but having broad applications. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Alrighty. So here on the slide is a picture of some of my students at they said briefly, I work as an operations coordinator at a Step Up Academy, which is a little private school for kids on the autism spectrum in the Philly area. I work as the operations coordinator, which is in the business office. I do a lot of purchasing and I help with a lot of the designing of what our rooms and spaces are going to look like. But I am also our DEI specialist, so I deal with things from that lens as well. So thank you, Kate, for your previous explanation of practices for neuroinclusion. You covered that fantastically, a lot of fantastic points. But what I wanted to grow on or build off of is when designing spaces for one group of people, you are designing spaces for all people. In our school, all of our students, or basically all of our students, have an autism diagnosis, or they have a similar diagnosis, or they have multiple diagnoses. And every single person is different. Every student is different. We have teenagers to preschoolers. Your sensory needs change, your space needs changes as you are a different age. But we still have our rooms look cohesive. You walk through our school buildings and we look like a school, and we look like we are well put together, but we have all these different options. So just in this photo alone, we have these cool, I call them Tetris couches because I think they look like Tetris. And honestly, everybody loves the Tetris couches. We have this little cubey shaped beanbag. We have these work pods in the back left corner. We have work pods that have one chair and table, and we have work pods that have two chairs and a table. So you can work together, or you could work really by yourself, or you could work in a really close-knit group if somebody pulls a chair up. But these are, design practices in space that are helpful to everybody. I know when we have meetings, we have staff meetings in the classrooms half the time, and a lot of us are sitting up on these Tetris couches. Or if you're somebody who thinks things are too loud, a lot of people like to sit in the cubby during the meeting. You're still participating in the meeting, but you're a little more included, enclosed. So it's not as overwhelming. Yeah. Yeah, and then we do other things too, especially between staff, like when we use the universal design for learning, when we put out information or talk to each other, we provide information in different ways. The same way we would do for our students, we do it for all the staff members as well.
Thank you, Ev. So we have our second poll. It's the same link, right? You can use the same link again, but let me make sure that it is on the right question. Give me just a minute.
So while you're doing that, I'll tell everyone what the question is.
Right.
This question, we want you to adapt something in your environment to help you focus better. But if you're unable to do so right now, think about what you could do. So again, you'll have an option of multiple choices that you can select many. And we want to see what you've modified or would modify to focus better.
So maybe we'll keep this to like a minute since we're running a bit over. So we'll keep it to a minute. Take a quick lap around if you need exercise. And it'd be great to get your opinion on this question.
Lots of options to read through Slido. I was trying to see how much
yes, I will.
system. How many options?
This is the
does
maximum number of options.
You might
Choice
even
is good.
more. Yes, exactly. The only thing it didn't allow was being able to type an other answer. So I figured I would iterate as many as I could in my head.
Take a walk. So I thought take a walk was the winning answer, but water and walk. Pets are popular.
I totally feel like I forgot to add stimming, but I am definitely bouncing my leg like crazy right now.
Yes. And I think this just shows too, right, how much of an impact the environment has on Rachel was talking about our executive functioning, and I know Ed was talking about this in our meeting before. It's not just the sensory environment, but how that impacts everything we do in a space.
Yes, so I wish I could keep it going, but I'm going to stop this share for now, and we will go back to our presentation for the final piece. Okay, so very important. What can you do now? I want to start with this thought from Natalia Lakowski, who is a neurodivergent application developer at IBM. She is head of their neurodiversity business resource group. And she thinks one of the most important things we can all do is to shift the conversation from passive awareness to actionable acceptance, ensuring the neurodivergent community is not only included in the conversation, but given key stakeholder and leadership roles. Rachel, do you want to say a bit?
Yes. We want to encourage you to start somewhere. This can mean the actionable acceptance that the individual from IBM mentioned and Jennifer. And this can be, learning about neurodiversity like you are right now, bringing your findings to where you work, or even starting a new neurodiversity initiative at your place of employment. You can look for partnerships. So no one can know everything. So you must work with those who are also passionate about this interest of neurodiverse inclusion. Everyone brings something new to the table, and you don't have to do it all alone. So just like, Kate, Ev, and Jennifer and myself, all from different disciplines, but shared passion of neurodiversity. And we're working together, learning that, actually our disciplines share a lot of things. And what they don't, we can compensate by having multiple team members. And then nothing about us is without us. So this is a phrase the disability world historically has used, but I'm sure many other communities do this as well. But for Ev and I as neurodivergents, this means including us in anything about neurodiversity. Next slide.
Right. And off of that also, remember the curb cut effect. The curb cut effect is kind of a saying now, but it happened when they put curb cuts in sidewalks. Originally, they put the curb cuts in the sidewalks to help wheelchair users, but found that this necessary change for one group of people was extremely helpful for the larger society. It's just in this picture alone, you have a family with small children, a family with a stroller, a kid on a scooter. All of them are using that curb cut to make their daily life easier. So any change you make to benefit one group has an effect on everybody else, and something you do to make somebody else's life easier could make like infinitely more people's lives easier as well.
Yes, and we know this conversation we had today had a lot of content, but we're really just scratching the surface of this whole conversation. I think I speak for all of us when we say we could talk about this for hours. So we do have a handout that we are going to share. I will put a link to it in the same Q&A once I have the chance to upload that onto a server, since I can't put the PDF directly, but there is a handout with more resources should you be interested in learning more. And we just want to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you learned something and that maybe you'll be inspired to join us in creating a world where there's more neuro inclusion.